Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Bhagavad-gita Satsang. I'm Hari-kirtana, and it is a pleasure for me to be here with you and an honor for me to have you here spending your time with me. I trust that I can be heard, and we will press ahead with our usual housekeeping. You can adjust your audio settings and your viewing options up in the upper right-hand corner. You need not be concerned with your own microphone or video camera because you cannot be seen or heard by me as I can be seen and heard by you. However, if you would like to make yourself heard to me, you can type a question into the Q&A box at any time. Our last class, we began chapter 9, the Yoga of Royal Secrets, with a discussion of levels of confidential knowledge, basic information, secret information, more secret information, and the most secret information. So we spoke a little bit about these different levels of teachings. We're going to look tonight at the levels of teachings in the Bhagavad Gita, or levels of realization that the Gita addresses in a slightly different way. But we covered the first 3 verses of chapter 9 in our last class. And in tonight's class, we will move ahead with knowledge of relationships and the ins and outs of being God. So we will look at some very paradoxical descriptions of God's relationship with the world, a very fundamental question of theology that Krishna will address in verses 4 through 10. Before we move on to those verses and our other considerations for this portion of the 9th chapter, we will chant our invocation mantra. The diacritical marks that you see indicating pronunciation cues for the transliterated Sanskrit, the dot over the M indicates that we close the back of the tongue against the back of the roof of the mouth as we bring our lips together out front. The bar over any vowel, in this case an A, indicates a long open version of the vowel as opposed to a short and truncated version of the vowel. So with that, I will chant. You can chant back. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. All right. Before we move on to the verses that we will take a look at this evening, last week we looked at 4 levels of instruction in the Bhagavad Gita. As I said earlier, general instructions, secret instructions, more secret instructions, meaning deeper secrets, and the most secret instructions, the deepest of secrets. And I outlined how these secrets are disseminated, how they are revealed by Krishna progressively throughout the Bhagavad Gita, from the 2nd chapter, his first instructions, to where we are at now, the 9th chapter, moving into the section on pure or unmixed devotional yoga. There's another way that we can look at the different levels of instruction in the Bhagavad Gita. 3 levels: spiritual materialism, impersonal spiritualism, and personal spiritualism. And toward the end of the last class, I touched on this distinction between impersonal and personal spiritualism, and how, depending on one's conception of what the ultimate goal of yoga is, one may measure one's progress along the path of yoga differently. One's conception of the ultimate goal determines the nature of one's conception of relationships, and therefore one's conception of what is proper practice. Which is to say that the practices may seem like they're the same, but the intention behind the practice is going to be different depending on your conception of relationships and the conception of the ultimate goal. Materialism, or material materialism, is rejected outright in the Bhagavad-gita as being the path of repeated birth and death, basically running in place for all intents and purposes. And impersonal spiritualism is in the category of deep knowledge, that is to say, understanding the spiritual ground of all being, the ultimate spiritual nature of existence as Brahman, that aspect of the Supreme Person that has no name, form, qualities, pastimes, or relationships. And there is a particular school of Vedanta that considers this conception of the absolute truth to be the highest conception. And we'll speak about that in a little more detail in just a moment. This is not an uncommon conception in Western religion. We also have this idea of the God that we pray to, who is a personal God, and the God that we think about that is beyond personness. And theologians have a tendency to think that the impersonal aspect, the God who is a being that is not a being or that is beyond being, is higher than any conception of a supreme being with a form, or that if the supreme being takes on a form, then somehow or other this impersonal aspect, or Brahman, has now become influenced or under the control of material nature, which Krishna has identified as being his own energy. So we'll see about the logic of that. Personal spiritualism is what is being advocated specifically in these last few chapters as we get into deeper and deepest knowledge or secrets, the idea of the Paramatma and ultimately the personal form of Bhagavan, Sri Krishna. There are 5 varieties of personal spiritualism. So in an earlier class, we looked at the different sampradayas or lineages that offer us some nice commentaries on the Bhagavad-gita at bhagavad-gita.org, the 4 major Vaishnava sampradayas, or the lineages that are associated with the with devotion to Vishnu or Krishna, are compiled onto this one website where you can get the commentaries of different acharyas or spiritual exemplars of a particular line of thought. So here are the 5 varieties. In Sanskrit, the first school of thinking is Vishishta Dvaitavada. So Vada means doctrine. So this would be the doctrine of specific non-dualism. Don't worry, I'm going to elaborate on each of these. I'll go down the list first, then we'll look at each in detail. The second, Dvaita Dvaitavada, the doctrine of dualistic non-dualism. I know that sounds like a contradiction. So many things in spiritual life do. Then, Shuddha Dvaitavada, purified dualism. Shuddha Dvaitavada, which is very slightly different, purified monism. And then Achintya Bheda Bheda Tattva, inconceivable simultaneous oneness and difference. So, here are the, here's just a sample of the website I referred to a moment ago, commentaries of the four authorized Vaishnava Sampradayas. So this is just a look at what the page looks like at bhagavad-gita.org if you want to go and check out the different commentaries from these different schools given by different teachers within these lineages, or in some cases the founders of these lineages, then that's a good place to go. Sri Chaitanya is the fifth exemplar that, and in his case, he arrives and establishes a school of thought that's an extension of one of the four Vaishnava Sampradayas, namely the one Brahma Sampradaya that previously is personified by Madhva. So we see here that you can have different teachers offering extensions or renovations to a particular lineage that take ideas even a step further. So let's look at this from the standpoint of historical development. So let me get me out of the way just in case I'm in the way. So traditionally, we understand that these different lineages are founded in inconceivable antiquity, which is to say the Brahma Sampradaya begins with Brahma at the beginning of the cosmic manifestation. Another Sampradaya is established by his sons, the Kumaras, called the Kumara Sampradaya. There's a Shiva Sampradaya. Shiva is also obviously primordial in his very nature. So the teachers who establish these schools and systematize the thought behind them in the modern era are going to start appearing shortly after the Buddha on the Indian subcontinent, beginning with Shankara. So with Shankara, we get the Smarta Sampradaya. Shankara's appearance time is under some dispute, either shortly before the Common Era, a couple of hundred years before the Common Era, or about 700 years after, depending on which authority you ask. He establishes the school of Advaita Vedanta, meaning absolute non-dualism. And this is a post-Buddhist, non-theistic way of thinking about the absolute truth. The objective is realization of Brahman, and Brahman is stipulated as being the only real thing. Absolute reality as an undifferentiated oneness of being, and this material world is understood to be an illusory superimposition on that absolute reality. It has no real existence. So Shankara proposes that Atman is identical to Brahman in every way, and therefore Atman is Brahman, or we are God. And our objective is to realize that there is only Brahman and we are Brahman. And because Brahman has no features, no name, form, quality, pastimes, relationships, it is, in the opinion of the Vaishnava lineages, a kind of crypto-Buddhism. What Shankara historically accomplishes is the reestablishment of the authority of the Vedas, which Buddha denied. So from a socio-cultural standpoint, Shankara is responsible for reestablishing the authority of the Vedas by offering a Buddhistic kind of interpretation. Next up, the Sri or Lakshmi Sampradaya is established by Ramanuja, whose dates are 1017 to 1137. He establishes Vishishtadvaita, or a theistic non-qualified kind, or theistic qualified non-dualism. That is, the objective is the realization of the relationship between Brahman and Atman. He disavows Shankara's theory of absolute oneness, on the basis of Atman is subject to illusion and Brahman is not subject to illusion. Therefore, there must be some difference between Atman and Brahman, and now understanding the relationship between Atman and Brahman is the ultimate goal, as opposed to realizing that one is Brahman. So a clear departure in how one thinks about such things. And so here we have the first of the Vaishnava Sampradayas, at least in terms of modern historical development. Following that, the Acharya of the Kumara Sampradaya, Nimbarka. The Kumara Sampradaya is a kind of, this is what I called dualistic non-dualism. It's also known as beta-beta philosophy, or what Nimbarka establishes is kind of independent existence of Ishvara, which is to say, Ishvara is independent of this material world, and the dependent or contingent existence of us. So now a little more definition to the nature of the relationship. We are dependent beings, and Ishvara is an independent being. So they are one, that is to say, Ishvara and Atman, us, are one in that souls in the universe cannot exist without Ishvara. So our oneness is actually rooted in that dependence. But Ishvara is different in that Ishvara is not a contingent being, not dependent on us. We could be or not be, but there's no question of Ishvara being. Next up, the Brahma Sampradaya, which is established by Madhva. This is now brings us a little further along into 1238 to 1317 is Madhva's dates. So Madhva teaches a kind of purified dualism, a little different from dualistic non-dualism. And his teachings are summarized in 9 short statements. The first is that Sri Krishna alone is the supreme absolute truth, or the one without a second. So he establishes this phrase, one without a second, in Shankara's way of thinking, is that there is only one, there is no other. So there is no second, numerically. Whereas here, one without a second means no one can compare. So Krishna alone is the absolute truth and nobody else is. Krishna is the object of knowledge in all the Vedas is our second statement. So ultimately, everything in the Vedas points to Krishna. The third statement is that the universe is real, as opposed to an illusory superimposition on the only reality. The fourth statement is that the difference between Ishvara and Jiva and matter are also real, that there is an actual distinction between individual living beings and the supreme living being, and the world in which we live. So a denial of this ultimate oneness. Then 5, Jiva souls are by nature the servants of the Supreme Person. So now further defining and refining the understanding of what the nature of the relationship is. There are 6 is there are 2 different categories of jivas or Atman, liberated and illusion. Some spiritual beings are under the influence of spiritual consciousness or the spiritual nature. Some that are also qualitatively the same kind of living being are under the influence of material consciousness or material nature. So they are qualitatively the same, but because jivas are by their very nature marginal, they can be in one place, one state of being, or another state of being. Statement 7 is that liberation means attaining a relationship at the feet, subordinate relationship with Bhagavan Krishna, or in other words, entering into an eternal relationship of service with the Supreme Lord. So in other words, if you act on the basis of the natural relationship between the jiva and the Supreme Person, then that action is in and of itself liberating, or places one in a state of liberation. Statement number 8, pure devotional service to Krishna is the only way to attain this liberation. And we will see some correlation to this idea throughout the Bhagavad-gita, particularly in this 9th chapter and the chapters that immediately follow that specifically speak about pure devotional service. Then the final statement from Madhava is that the truth may be known in 3 different ways: by direct perception, by inference or logic, and by spiritual sound, or the authority of the Vedas, that is, hearing from a source of transcendental knowledge. This is also shared in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Patanjali says there's 3 possible ways to get correct information: direct perception, logic, or hearing, oral reception. So that's Madhva and the Brahma Sampradaya. The Rudra Sampradaya, represented by and expressed by Vallabha, who comes almost 200 years later. Rudra is another name for Shiva. Vallabha establishes a purified monism as opposed to a purified dualism. So he posits a qualitative oneness, but without the bliss. And what that means is the bliss of the Supreme Person is unparalleled. And, so there's a quantitative difference between the part and the whole. And the material world is accepted as real insofar as it is a transformation of spiritual energy, which is how the sort of reality of the material world is established in the Vedanta Sutras themselves. Shankara actually comes up with a theory of creation that is different from the theory of creation found in the Vedanta Sutras that he is writing a commentary on in order to explain. So whereas the Vedanta Sutras declare the material world as coming into existence by virtue of a transformation of spiritual energy, Shankara posits this idea of the material world as an illusory superimposition on Brahman. So 2 different ideas, with very different implications. So Brahman, according to the Rudra Sampradaya, is unknown, but becomes visible when manifest as a multitude of beings in the world and as the world itself. So this is a little bit closer to the idea of an impersonal truth that only appears in person in the material world where form happens and multiplicity of beings happen. So there's a tinge, I have to admit, I can't completely wrap my head around the teachings of Vallabha that are known as Pushti Marg, or the path of getting the grace of Lord Krishna, on account of this kind of implicit impersonalism beneath the idea that the highest expression of spiritual emotion is that of motherly love, also known as Vatsalya Bhava. The preferred mantra in the tradition of Pushti Marg is Shri Krishna Sharanam Mama. You may have heard that mantra. And it is a mantra that seeks to take shelter of Krishna. So there is definitely a sense of relationship, of spiritual relationship, and spiritual relationship as a means to understanding Brahman. But I honestly, in spite of reading the commentaries of people associated with Pushti Marg, I have to confess I haven't been able to really wrap my head around it, and there may be any number of possible reasons for that. Be that as it may, that brings us back to the Brahma Sampradaya again. And here, Chaitanya, Sri Chaitanya, who appears 1486 to 1534, extends on Madhva's idea with this idea of inconceivable, simultaneous oneness and difference. This is the idea that everything is Krishna, but nothing is Krishna save and except for Krishna himself. That there is a qualitative oneness, a quantitative difference. In this way of thinking, the ultimate spiritual emotion is considered to be not the motherly love of Krishna's mom for Krishna, but rather of the cowherd girls of Vrindavan, a kind of almost illicit conjugal love of young people. So this is understood to be the ultimate fulfillment of the true nature of the self. Now, one thing that's important here is that in the Chaitanya school of Vedanta, Chaitanya asserts that the meaning of the Vedic texts, like the Bhagavad-gita, is self-evident. We've spoken before about self-evidence. That is to say, the text means exactly what it says. There's no need to interpret the text, to impose some other meaning other than what it says. There's no need to allegorize the text. It is not something that requires an interpretation of symbolism, but rather the text actually just means exactly what it says. And if we are to take the text at face value, then we'll understand it. Simple. That doesn't mean that it isn't difficult, but it is a simple approach. And from an intellectual standpoint, some people have criticized this kind of simpleness. A literal understanding of Scripture tends to be dismissed as anti-intellectual, whereas an allegorical or interpretive approach to text is usually preferred by intellectual types of people. However, I have not found, personally, that an interpretive or allegorical reading of the text lends itself to the most comprehensive exposition of the meaning of the text for myself. So, just so we're clear on this, I am presenting Bhagavad-gita to you from the vantage point, from the angle of vision of this Chaitanya school of simultaneous, inconceivable, simultaneous oneness and difference. And the idea that the meaning of the text is self-evident. It means exactly what it says it means. So as we look at this week's verses, I hope you will keep these different ways of understanding Vedic wisdom texts in mind so that you can decide for yourself which angle of vision provides the most comprehensive and complete, sensible way of understanding the text. Which way gives a sense of the meaning that does not have any internal contradictions, that can be applied in any practical or relevant circumstance. It doesn't leave anything out. So with that in mind, let's proceed to our verses, 4 through 10, translations and commentary. So this time we're covering a few more verses as opposed to last week. So I will read through the verses, then we'll chant a couple of them and look at their translations in some detail. So text number 4 of chapter 9. I pervade the entirety of creation. This is, of course, Krishna speaking. I pervade the entirety of creation with my invisible feature. All beings are situated in me, but I am not in them. And yet, all that is created does not rest in me. Behold my magnificent mystic power. Although I am situated everywhere, as the maintainer of all beings, I am not a part of this world, for my very self is the cause of all that is created. Verse 6, try to understand. Just as the mighty wind blowing everywhere abides always in space, all created beings abide in me. Verse 9, O son of Kunti, at the end of a cycle of eons, all beings enter into my primordial nature. At the beginning of another cycle, I release them again. Text 8, by my will, the sum of all beings, which are powerless against the force of material nature, are automatically released again and again into the cosmic manifestation. Text 9. O conqueror of riches, I am never bound by these activities. I remain detached from all such activities as if seated at a distance. And text number 10. Under my direction, O son of Kunti, all moving and non-moving beings are brought forth by the power of this material nature. Hence, this cosmic manifestation revolves in cycles. So now let's go back and look at each one of these verses and dig a little deeper into each one. Verse 4 is our first verse, and we are going to chant the Sanskrit for this verse. There's no real change in the diacritical marks from before, except the very last word. You see that there's a dot under the H at the end of the word, at the end of the line. And what that means is we will echo the vowel that precedes that H back. So there'll just be a short bounce back of that vowel. So I'll chant each line, you chant each line back. Here we go. Maya tatam idam sarvam jagad avyaktamurtina matsthani sarvabhutani na chaham teshvastitaha. I did forget something. The C, letter C, is always a CH sound in transliterated Sanskrit. So the second word of the fourth line is chaham, as opposed to kaham or saham. If you want an S sound, you get an S. If you want a K sound, you get a K. And that leaves the C to represent a CH sound. So the translation of this verse, which is not 9:1, it is 9:4. I pervade the entirety of creation with my invisible feature. All beings are situated in me, but I am not in them. So let's go back for just a moment and look at this second word in the second line, avyakta, and as a combined word, avyakta murtina. So avyakta means unmanifest, murti means form. So in the context of this verse, avyakta murtina means a form you cannot see, as opposed to formlessness. It would be a contradiction to say avyakta murtina, or a formless form. So in this case, avyakta murtina means an invisible feature. That is to say, there's a form involved, but it cannot be seen. So why not? Because Krishna can only be experienced directly through the medium of spiritual senses. Now, of course, Krishna is completely independent. He can reveal himself to anyone at any time, in any place, in any way that he likes. If we want to understand or see Krishna pervading the entirety of creation, then we actually have to have some kind of spiritual vision. Which is to say, our senses need to be purified by the process of yoga that Krishna has been describing up to this point. So spiritual senses are awakened primarily and most easily and efficiently through the cultivation of transcendental love. Hence, this chapter is the most secret knowledge, which is the cultivation of a relationship with Krishna based on love, is the means by which one experiences Krishna. This makes perfect sense if you consider that the absolute truth is a person. Because if someone wants to experience you completely, then the mandatory prerequisite for you revealing yourself to that person is there has to be love and trust. So here, in this chapter, we will hear how the cultivation of a relationship of transcendental love is going to not just awaken our senses, but inspire Krishna to awaken our senses in much the way that a lover awakens one's beloved, which is kind of a very cool way to think about how God thinks about us. So in our next verse, now we get to some really interesting paradoxical stuff in these next two verses, actually. So I'll put these two together. This is 5 and 6. And yet, all that is created does not rest in me. Behold my magnificent mystic power. Although I am situated everywhere as the maintainer of all beings, I am not a part of this world, for my very self is the cause of all that is created. Try to understand. Just as the mighty wind blowing everywhere abides always in space, all created beings abide in me. So here Krishna is giving us an example of something that, an analogy that will help us to understand something that sounds totally contradictory, because he's already established that he is within the heart of all beings and present everywhere, and yet he's saying that he's not actually in everything, and that the whole creation doesn't rest in him, but it does. All right, so how are we to wrap our heads around this? So Krishna is simultaneously everything. And yet nothing is Krishna, save and except for Krishna himself. So that's also inconceivable. Sometimes we like to think, or we hear the idea, that everything is God. And in this verse, or this set of verses, Krishna is saying, actually, that's not the case. That while I am present everywhere, not everything is me. And although I am in the world as the maintainer of everyone, I am not under the influence of this world. I'm not a part of this world. So philosophically, sometimes we hear this idea that Brahman, the spiritual oneness of being, becomes manifest in form by entering into the material world and then becomes material, like kind of a materialized Vishnu. Because we think that to have a form means to be material. By definition, a form means material. And here Krishna is saying, nope, that's not the case. That even though I am invisibly permeating everything, I'm omnipresent, all-pervading, and at the same time, here I am, walking around in the world talking to you, still, I am not of this world. I am not participating in the cosmic manifestation the same way everyone else is, because I'm actually the source of this cosmic manifestation and therefore beyond it. Now, he gives us a way to visualize this. The wind is blowing in the sky. And the sky acts as a container for the wind. They're two separate things. The space that the wind is blowing in is not affected by the blowing of the wind. So remember, air and space are two different elements: earth, water, fire, air, space. 5 gross material elements described earlier. So air moves within the space, but the space is not affected by the movement of the air. And the air is dependent on the space, because if there was no space, the air wouldn't have anywhere to go. Can't move if there's no space to move in. So the air is dependent on the space, but the space is not dependent on the air. And while the air moves within the confines of the space is not limited by the air. And the space is not attached to the air, independent. So we can think of Krishna's relationship with the world kind of like that. We can move within the confines of the energy of the material world, which Krishna has described as his energy. And we can move anywhere we want. We have free will to a limited degree. Therefore, we can move this way, that way, or the other way. And so it appears that we are independent. And this is an illusion. Because even though we have a minute degree of independence, we're actually completely dependent beings. That's our nature. Because without the material energy, I wouldn't have a body to scratch my nose with. I wouldn't have a nose to scratch. There would be no earth for me to walk on, no air for me to breathe, no space for me to move through. I'm completely dependent on all the material elements, as well as the metaphysical elements of mind, sense, mind, intelligence, and ego. And my very spiritual being is also dependent which is to say, I'm a contingent being. I could be or could not be. But Krishna is not dependent on my existence. I'm dependent on Krishna's existence, the same way that space is not dependent on the existence of air, but air and its movement depends entirely on the existence of space. I hope that that makes that a little more clear-ish. If we go back to a previous chapter, the 5th chapter, 13 through 15, Krishna describes those who are linked to him in karma yoga, the yoga of action. And we can take this verse, 9:6, put it at the end of a little cluster of verses from the 5th chapter, 13 through 15, and now we get a nice example of the elliptical nature of the Gita, because this cluster of verses will also just kind of flow together very nicely. So I'm going to read from 5:13 through 15 and then go directly to 9:6. Mentally renouncing all actions, an embodied master of the senses lives happily within the city of 9 gates, neither acting nor causing actions to occur. The master of this city, meaning the spirit soul within the body, who is aloof from the actions of material nature, does not create activities, does not induce people to act, and does not connect actions to their results. All of this is set into motion by the conditioning of material nature. Nor does the Supreme Lord accept responsibility for anyone's virtuous or evil deeds. All living beings are bewildered by the ignorance that covers their knowledge. Try to understand, just as the mighty wind blowing everywhere abides always in space, all created beings abide in me. So, within the space of Krishna's energy, we can move in a virtuous way or an evil way, and it's on us, because Krishna, the Supreme Person, does not accept responsibility for our actions. That is our minute independence. And yet, we are completely independent on the Supreme Person and the energy of the Supreme Person for our very existence. So this, to me, indicates a nice example of simultaneous oneness and difference, or the extension of the teachings of the Brahma Sampradaya given by Sri Chaitanya, the idea of an inconceivable simultaneous oneness and difference. That, to me, has been the easiest way to make sense of what Krishna is telling us in this cluster of verses, which we will now continue with as we move on to verse number 7. O son of Kunti, at the end of a cycle of eons, all beings enter into my primordial nature. At the beginning of another cycle, I release them again. And I'll put this together now with the next verse. By my will, the sum of all beings, which are powerless against the force of material nature, are automatically released again and again into the cosmic manifestation. So here Krishna is speaking about cycles of time, very, very big cycles of time, and how, as we move through the space of the material world over time, we may come to the end of a cycle of time, still have karma to play out, still be influenced by material nature, and therefore at the end of a cycle of time, we basically go into stasis. We are brought into a state of suspended animation until the next cycle comes around, and then we are released once again out into the material nature to play out our karma and presumably acquire more, unless we've gotten the idea that ditching our karma would be a better way to go. So back in the 8th chapter, verses 17 and 19, we heard a little bit about this idea of cyclical time and how time is calculated according to Brahma's days and nights. So in that those verses, Krishna says, those who understand the truth about day and night, the nature of time, know that Brahma's day lasts for 1,000 ages and that his night ends after the passage of yet another 1,000 ages. And at the dawn of Brahma's day, all beings emerge from the unmanifest state. With the arrival of Brahma's nightfall, they are absorbed once again into the unmanifest. Over and over, all are helplessly annihilated with the arrival of Brahma's night, only to come into being once again upon the commencement of Brahma's day. So Krishna is now circling back to this idea of here's what you see if you understand the big picture of how time works. And in this verse specifically, as we will see, we're not talking about Brahma's days, but the culmination of Brahma's days. So the other interesting thing in this verse is Krishna is speaking about releasing every being in the material world en masse as like an aggregate. Like we're all individuals, but we're also part of a group. And that group that we're a part of can be treated as one thing, an aggregate of all beings. So we are released en masse out into the material world, and we are absorbed back into the condition of stasis in between sessions of cosmic manifestation. So it's everyone all at once according to their karma, rather than biological evolution. In other words, in this model, all different forms of being show up more or less at the same time in order to fulfill the karma of all beings according to what kind of birth they're supposed to take, as opposed to the modern scientific paradigm that we currently tend to just accept without questioning it too much, that matter comes first, and then all by itself, there's transformations that result ultimately in beings that show or demonstrate the appearance of consciousness and conscious self-awareness. So let's take a look here once again at our chart of the life of Brahma. So previously in the 8th chapter, Krishna was speaking about what happens at the end of one day of Brahma, a kalpa. So that would be here. And there's a partial devastation after 4.32 billion years, which is the length of Brahma's day. When he checks out at the end of the evening, at the end of the day, then a good portion of the universe is tucked up and put away and comes back the next day. And that's what Krishna spoke about in the 8th chapter. But here in the 9th, kalpa kshaye, so not just a kalpa, but kalpa kshaye, kalpa adau, the end of the cycle of Brahma's days and the end of the complete lifetime of Brahma, which according to Vedic calculation is 311.04 trillion years, is being referred to. So at the end of Brahma's lifetime, if we're not done with the material world, then suspended animation. Whereas, and then at the end of that period of suspended animation, we come back for yet another life of Brahma, and somebody else gets to be Brahma. And we enter into yet another period of cosmic manifestation that can last for this inconceivably long period of time. So that's that. And Krishna is advising us to, blow this pop stand and get out of this whole deal. Which brings us to verse 9. O conqueror of riches, I am never bound by these activities. That is to say, the activities of the living beings coming and going into stasis and out of stasis, and Krishna's presiding over the material nature. I remain detached from all such activities as if seated from a distance. So once again, we can go back to a previous chapter and look at a few verses and then connect this verse to it, and we see once again that now it creates a complete and coherent thought. Once again, the elliptical nature of Krishna's teachings in the Gita. So let's go back to verses 20 through 22 in chapter 3. Indeed, by proper action alone, kings like Janaka attain perfection, if for no other reason you are obliged to act for the welfare of the world. The actions of a great leader will surely be emulated by others, and the standards set by such a leader serve as the example for all the world to follow. O son of Pritha, Arjuna, there are no duties within these three worlds that I am obliged to perform, nor is there anything I aspire to obtain. Nevertheless, I engage myself in prescribed duties. O conqueror of riches, I am never bound by these activities. I remain detached from all such activities as if seated at a distance. So just because Krishna is not affected by these actions doesn't mean that he's got nothing to do. I mean, if you were the Supreme Person, would you just sit around and do nothing while delegating all of the obligations in the material world out to another aspect of yourself? So I don't think so. So Krishna is simultaneously here, present, all pervading in the material world, and showing up from time to time in a particular place personally for the sake of giving shelter to his devotees and having a word with the non-devotees who may need to hear from him, and establishing the principles of religion, as we have previously discussed. But at the same time, he also has a personal life. That personal life is spoken of in another text called the Brahma Samhita, kind of corollary text, that describes Krishna as always involved in his eternal blissful spiritual activities. But he has nothing to do with these material activities. So again, present and active here, and yet at the same time, not so much. Because Krishna's real business is the business of spiritual relationships. So he facilitates our actions here, presides over them, controls them. We are dependent on him for them, and yet he's got other things going on. Doing yet not doing, engaged yet disengaged. So this is the paradoxical nature of Krishna's relationship with the material world. Which brings us to our final verse, verse 10. Under my direction, O son of Kunti, all moving and non-moving beings are brought forth by the power of this material nature. Hence, this cosmic manifestation revolves in cycles. So he's kind of got it on automatic pilot. Just like if you go to my website and you would like to get a free copy of my ebook called How to Deliver a Great Dharma Talk, you can put your name and email address on the form, click the button, and automatically you will go to a thank you page. You will receive an opportunity to download this free ebook. It's free. And it's automatic. I don't have to personally do it. I set it up. I'm the one who controls it. Getting it is completely dependent on me. But I'm not there doing it right this moment. You, of course, as soon as we're done here, should go do it right that moment. I mean, you know, if you're a yoga teacher and you want to learn how to deliver a great Dharma talk, but I'm not personally there. It's automatic. Same thing. So in this verse, the Sanskrit words Maya, by my, Adi, from above, Aksha, eyes, are put together in the word, the compound word, Mayadhyakshena, which means under my supervision or under my supervision. Krishna has supervision. So Krishna provides supervision, but he doesn't get directly involved in the automatic process that he's put in motion in order to facilitate how all moving and non-moving beings move about through time and space in the material world. We are not destined to take birth in a particular way by Krishna because we create our own destiny. He's not responsible for how we move, and yet we move within the space that he creates for us to move in. So we are architects of our own destinies, and yet we are dependent beings. And that, I believe, is the end. Oops. Hello. I am asking you to share. Oh, I'm hitting the wrong button. Okay, there we go. I'll learn how to use this thing one day. Tonight's class has been verses 4 through 10 of chapter 9, the Yoga of Royal Secrets. We spoke about knowledge of relationships and the paradoxical ins and outs of being God. If you have any questions, of course, I would be very, very happy to receive them. And if you don't have a question right this moment, or if you're watching this after the fact, and even if you do, you can reach me with your questions or comments at Hari-kirtana.com. Hari-kirtana.com, of course, is where you can go to download your free ebook on how to deliver a great Dharma talk if you are a yoga teacher and would like to avail yourself of that free offer. Next week, the Yoga of Royal Secrets continues with fools and demons. We'll also talk about the activities of great souls and in the process cover verses 11 through 14 of this 9th chapter. And that brings us to the end of our class this evening. Thank you very, very much for spending your time here with me. It is always a great honor to know that you are there and a pleasure for me to spend this time with you. I look forward to seeing you next time. And until then, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your, whatever you're having a rest of. Have a nice night.